Get it open for you. All right. So, just as far as the announcements that we went over today, so you have back to school night on Wednesday, September 9th. Our class period is going to be from 7:05 to 7:15. So if your parents are interested in hearing a little bit about what we're going to be doing this year, or if they have some concerns or whatever, I'd love to get a chance to meet them. That's going to be between 7:05 and 7:15. We'll be sending out the invitations for those meetings. It will be digital. And so and so you don't need to worry about going anywhere necessarily. All right. Also, I just wanted to update you that next week is a spirit week. I know a lot of you are involved in leadership, so you have seen this before. Tuesday, it's Too Tired Tuesday, so it's going to be pajama day. 9/9, it's vacay Wednesday. So in memory of those vacation plans that we lost, wear some kind of vacation-y tropical type gear. 9/10 is Jersey Thursday for all of those sports events that we lost. And then lastly, 9/11 is Freedom Friday. We will not be together on 9/11, but I will post something on Google Classroom in honor of 9/11 because I know a lot of you, luckily, were not alive to have experienced 9/11. You guys were just born and kind of born into this post 9/11 world. And so I feel like it's important to kind of keep that memory alive and honor it. Okay, so our opener question today was for you to use your imagination and make a list of 5 important settlers' jobs that you would list for the first colony at Jamestown to be successful. So like, who would you need to bring with you to be successful in building a colony across the ocean that you've never been to before? A lot of the answers were very reasonable. Kind of this expectation that you would bring somebody who would farm food, bring someone who knew how to build stuff, people who would be willing to do the labor, so people who were laborers of some kind, to establish this colony. We're going to find that is not what happened. But to us, it makes rational sense to bring people that make sense, but that is not what the English were thinking. So as far as England's search for empire, it was mostly individual reasons. So for individual people versus like the nation, there were benefits for the nation for England, but they had some big fish to fry at this time. And so it was more about individual people seeking wealth for themselves, so economic opportunity. England had really high unemployment rates. You see, the Columbian Exchange that we've already talked about created this really incredible blow up in population because now not only is there more food that can be cultivated, but it is more nutritious. So not only are more people living, but more people are living longer. And so there's not enough jobs, there's not enough land. So primogeniture is like inheriting land. The problem is that only the firstborn son inherits land. What do you do with the second, third, fourth, fifth son? How do you prevent after your death or having your brother having you assassinated? How do you prevent that? Because land is what makes you a noble. If you don't have land, you can't be a noble. So how do you keep them in the noble class and keep them happy without any land? So that's going to be one of the draws to the New World is these big land grants that they're going to receive. And then political and religious freedom and also investors. You're going to see based on the different areas that people move to are going to be influenced by their motivation. So political freedom, religious freedom, or if you're there to make money. One of the big things, so the English waited 100 years to get involved in colonization. They started with Roanoke, and we'll talk about that here in a second, but there were some, like I said, big fish to fry with England. So England was in the middle of some big stuff. They were going through a civil war. Elizabeth I becomes this great ruling, powerful queen. The Spanish want to try to marry her off to Philip of Spain, which for those of you who took AP European history, these people should be very familiar. This is Philip II. You can very much see that Habsburg inbred jaw that he's got going there. This is like the selfie filter. These court painters, their job was to make them look the best that they could. My best judgment here is that you've got a beard fish with that Habsburg chin that's going on under there. So Philip II wants to marry Elizabeth I as an alliance thing. It's not like they were in love. And when she says no, Philip is mad. So essentially, this is an oversimplified version, but he tries to invade the British, and it is an absolute slaughter. So there's just big stuff going on in England. They're just not interested in these big time colonies in the same way. So like I've already mentioned, the region that people settled in are very much going to be determined by the motivations they have. And that's what we're going to start to look at today and over the next few days. All right, so early English settlements. Like I said, why did they wait 100 years to begin colonization? So internal religious strife, Catholics versus Protestants. You have this big split. You remember King Henry VIII from world history or from AP European history. Divorced, beheaded, and died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. He's the guy who wanted a divorce so bad that he broke off from the Catholic Church and made himself the head of the Church of England. And that was the Protestants. Okay, but then you had the people, particularly the Scots and the Irish, who were still very Catholic. And then on top of that, they didn't want to be ruled by the British. So there was major conflict within the country. You have the defeat of the Spanish in the 1588 Armada, and this is going to open up the New World because now we've completely obliterated the Spanish fleet. They can't protect their colonies. And so the Spanish are going to become very vulnerable, among many reasons. The British, like I said, also attempted to settle an island on the eastern seaboard in the Chesapeake Bay, and they were not successful. Part of the issue is who they were sending. You see at the beginning, and they're still going to have this issue for another 100 years, that there's this image that they're going to be able to enslave the natives to do all of the work. Because the people who are interested in going to the New World and taking this big risk are those second, third, fourth, fifth sons who want to own land. And so their expectation, their experience is that they're going to be served. And so these early colonies are going to fail because they don't have the tools. I am not going to play the video because the last lecture got cited for copyright. So I will link the video in the attachment so that you can watch the video about the Roanoke colony, okay? Transitions. Okay, so our first permanent English colony is going to be in Jamestown, Virginia. Virginia is going to be named after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. Okay, so the location, again, we've got the Chesapeake Bay, and this is part of it is because of its location. So Virginia has very rich soil. It's located very firmly between kind of those northern colonies with the French and the Dutch, as well as the Spanish to the south in Florida. So it's in a good middle ground spot. And it's a relatively small settlement, but it's in kind of this water supported area, but it's very swampy. There's some other elements that we'll look at too. So it's established in 1607. So we have Columbus all the way back in 1492. We don't have a real established colony until 1607, and it's by charter granted by King James I. So just to put this in perspective, you have colonies are created. So the king owns all of the land. Okay, and he gives that land in a charter or a grant, which means that it doesn't have to be repaid, with the expectation that you're going to be loyal to him as king. Okay, so this first charter is going to be given to a joint stock company. A joint stock company is essentially a business. It's a company where people have invested their money in hopes that they grow their wealth. So we are established from the beginning as a capitalist, money-producing kind of idea. So when you look at American history and you kind of examine it along with capitalism, it is a very important part of us from our founding. It wasn't something that developed late. It was something that has always kind of been a part of us. Okay, so King James II, like I said, is going to grant that charter and wants to settle and civilize the Americas. The reason that they want to do that is just to be able to maintain. He wants to prevent Spanish advancements in the New World and find a passage to Asia, which we know is not going to be successful. But remember we talked about balance of power. Okay, balance of power, mercantilism, this idea that there's only so much money to go around, and if you have it, I can't have it, and if you have it, you're more powerful than me, and we potentially go to war. So they want to make sure that the Spanish don't get any more, because all of a sudden the Spanish became incredibly wealthy. They are really going to kind of fall off the map. They don't make a lot of good long-term decisions with their money. So the Spanish are kind of become non-players eventually. But at this point, they're very powerful. Okay, so the Virginia Company is a joint stock company. These are the highlights. So a joint stock company, it's a group of wealthy investors and shareholders. The people that they send over are going to be people who are out looking to make a fortune. They plan to establish settlements for profit. So this isn't like a family establishment, okay? This colony is established to make money. Okay, so they convince people to go to this place they've never heard of, never seen. One element that's not going to be discussed on this slide is books. Books are going to paint this place as a beautiful land of wealth and opportunity and like this big adventure. And you can thank people like John Smith and his book about his not true story with Pocahontas. But they're going to be seeking opportunities. They also expected that they were going to become wealthy from gold and minerals. They had heard all of these fantastic stories from Cortez and Pizarro and all just this enormous amount of wealth that you could find, that the streets were lined with gold and that there were natives that you could enslave and that you were going to be rich just by walking on the land. Okay, so the initial voyage. So in December 1606, 105 settlers and entrepreneurs are going to set off to America. Okay, they're going to arrive in Virginia in 1607. And from the very beginning, if we're looking at some of those looking at our early ideas, our foundings, Edward Maria Wingfield is going to be elected president of the governing council and selects the island location. Okay, one thing I think is really important to note here at this point is that England has a history with representative government that is very different from any other country in the world at this point. Again, going back to King Henry VIII, they have the Magna Carta. He's in charge of protecting the Constitution. And then they have representative governments that are supposed to represent the people and make laws. This was unique in the world at the time. And it's going to be brought to the Americas, this idea that you have a certain level of self-government. Though it is kind of elitist and doesn't include everybody, it was a seed planted. Okay, I'm going to skip that for now. We'll come back to that on Thursday. So why did they pick an island? Of all the places you could pick, why would you pick an island? So, big one, it was far enough inland from the Spanish that they could hide and not have to deal with fighting with the Spanish. It also had deep water anchor for ships. This is going to be huge. We will continue this theme throughout the year, that these waterways are so important to economic development because you need the money to build the country. And that, again, is going to be a major theme throughout the history of the United States, especially when we start talking about conflicts over the Mississippi River, which is such a huge factor. Okay, and then on top of that, there are swamps and rivers that offer protection from local Native Americans. So it's surrounded by swampland. It's very difficult to get through, though Native Americans do just fine getting through it. Okay, so Native Americans at this time, there's going to be about 14,000 Powhatan Indians that lived in the Virginia area. Okay, so these are long-term established groups. 14,000 is not small. That's a lot of people. Especially when we think about Native American groups, we don't generally think of 14,000 people. That's the number of people it takes to fill up Bullard every day times 7. And that's how many people are in the Powhatan village area. Chief Powhatan's daughter is the famous Pocahontas, and her story is actually really interesting. The Disney movie is not accurate. Okay, so potential sources of conflict between Native Americans and settlers. One, they don't believe in land ownership. They see land ownership in the way that we see like owning air. You can't own air. It's something that we all share and we all should take care of, but you don't own it. You can't own it. How can you own land? They also had very regular bathing and grooming practices. So they bathed and shaved every day, which was not the case for Europeans. Europeans were historically gross, especially at this point, and that was well known throughout the world. They also were animistic, which means they worshipped spirits in nature. So when you worship nature as your gods or representative of your gods, that's called animistic. And they didn't have a structured church in the way that the British believed that it should exist. So they didn't see it as organized religion. They saw it as paganism, that they worshipped multiple gods. And there's a lot of really inflammatory language around religion at this point because of the Reformation, because of the civil wars around Christianity in general in Europe at the time. So they're going to have very strong language for people who are not Christian at all. Okay, so this is just kind of the establishment of the fort. If you look really closely, you'll notice that they are very close to the edge here. The goal is to be able to ship stuff out to make money. Okay, so this is the fort initially. You can see that kind of the shape is designed, focused on the ocean, focused on the trade. Okay, so life in the Chesapeake. It is a swamp. Some of you have lived in the South. Some of you have been to the South. I didn't really truly understand until I lived in the South. It's what's called a subtropical climate, which is not something that you think of when you think of the United States. But it is hot. It is wet. It is muggy, and it attracts mosquitoes. And one of the biggest issues with the mosquito problem is that some of the worst diseases that have ever hit mankind are carried by mosquitoes. And so things like malaria and diphtheria and dysentery are all carried by mosquitoes. And so people are just dying left and right of all these mosquito-borne diseases, as well as they're not eating. Okay, so toward the end of this, or in kind of the middle of this Jamestown colony, they refer to it as the starving time. And again, it's because the settlers that came over were not accustomed or expecting the need to work. Okay, so they were not expecting they'd need to work. You have the gentry. So you have gentlemen who've come with these big 10,000 acre land grants from the king, but they can't work the land. And then you have these adventurer single men who really came to like make their fortune. And so they didn't come prepared to have to grow crops or start a family or, figure out how to feed themselves, period. They didn't bring doctors. They brought goldsmiths. They brought people who make jewelry. They didn't bring carpenters or farmers or doctors. It wasn't well thought out. They thought that they would enslave the native population, and particularly with the Powhatan group, that was not going to happen. They were very powerful. And also you have that disease element that you've seen already. They also did not plan for such harsh winters. Even though on the map it appears that latitude-wise, these places should have similar climates, there are weather, particularly in the South and in a lot of parts of the United States, there are extremes. So you have extreme weather one way or another. Hurricanes were not something they had really dealt with, and that's something that you see a lot in Virginia, as well as really extreme snowy winters. They also spent too much time searching for gold and not enough time searching for food. Okay, so the big three. You have disease from an infected river as well as mosquitoes. So these people were going to the bathroom and pouring all of their waste into the rivers and then drinking it, and being diseased by their own waste. as well as they weren't planting any crops, and then attacks by local Native Americans. Now, you can't 100% blame the Native Americans because they were trying to enslave them. They didn't treat them well. They talked about them like they were like they were subhuman. And so Native Americans weren't about that life. So, as far as native contact goes, that region was controlled by the Powhatan Confederacy. So we are going to be united in our early phases of our country as a confederacy. Okay? So we're going to be tied together very loosely, kind of by general ideas, but we're essentially separate countries. That idea doesn't come from Europe. It comes from the Powhatan Confederacy. So you have one tribe that's kind of in control, and then you have a bunch of other tribes that have teamed up together that share a value system. And they come together and they work together. It's kind of like the EU. So the European Union, like they're all separate countries, but they share money and they vote on stuff together, and they kind of have these shared ideals. So Pocahontas was one of the younger daughters of the Powhatan chief, and her name actually means trouble. And so there's kind of this idea that maybe her kind of presentation to Europeans, to John Smith, was almost kind of like a slight, like, oh, I'm giving you my daughter. But it was like, it was traditional to do that, and B, she was kind of troubled and problematic, and so John Smith's vision of that might have been a little off. But unfortunately, the story that John Smith writes, he's an incredible writer, but not particularly truthful. And that was pretty common with adventure books at the time. Your goal was to go out, be an adventurer, come up with a good story, and make a fortune on your book. And then people would read your book and want to become adventurers too. Okay, so John Smith makes up this whole story about Pocahontas and her saving him. And there's a good chance it was probably ritualistic, like John Smith didn't really know what was happening. And there definitely wasn't a romantic relationship unless he was a creeper, because she was like 10. But she does end up marrying John Rolfe. And so this guy, if you've ever seen Pocahontas 2, and he... Again, the story's not 100% true, really even close to like 5% true, but he's really going to be the man that she marries and kind of establishes a union with the Powhatan Confederacy. So the Virginia colony is really struggling before John Smith gets there. He's supposedly saved by Pocahontas. We've already mentioned that. But he's going to take leadership of the colony, and he's going to take a Christian philosophy that he that will not work shall not eat. So if you aren't willing to get off your butt and help grow the food, you're not going to eat. And it's amazing how quickly things turned around. Not perfect, not great, but better. So when help arrives, only about 60 colonists are going to be left when those 2 ships arrive from England with resources to these new settlers. And one of the things that's going to happen is John Rolfe is going to introduce the first cash crop. A cash crop is a crop grown specifically to make money. Now, a cash crop can be a food. It can be something that's consumed, but we're going to talk about rice, for example. It wasn't grown to feed the population. It was grown to make money. Tobacco is going to be the major one. Okay, so tobacco and sugar are 2 of the most addictive circumstances on the face of the earth. And really the new world and the wealth of the old world is going to be built on these 2 substances, tobacco and sugarcane. Okay, so John Rolfe is going to create a smoother breed of tobacco that they grow that is going to become wildly popular in England and all across Europe. So this demand for this tobacco, because it requires a tropical environment. It requires a tropical environment. Dogs are making noises in the background. It requires a tropical environment to grow tobacco. It needs to be wet. It needs to be hot. And so this was the perfect place to grow it. So tobacco becomes a cash crop that colonists can sell. It's not something that they can eat. And John Rolfe is going to marry Pocahontas, which is going to bring peace. So like I said, it's going to kind of be a uniting factor, which if you think about the nature of the Powhatan Confederacy, that was kind of the standard. Like, you can marry my wife as a marker of peace between us, that we are united through you marrying my daughter. Okay, so labor is going to arrive. So growing tobacco is very labor intensive, and more colonists are needed to work. So the first thing that they're going to turn to is this concept of indentured servitude. Okay, so you will hear this concept of like white slavery in the Americas. If you spend any time kind of perusing the internet, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about indentured servitude, which is in fact a form of slavery, but it's term slavery. So basically what happens with indentured servitude is that a poor English person agrees to come over and work for someone in exchange for the cost of their trip. So they may be indentured for 7, 12 years. Okay. Now, one of the things that was an advantage to the investor that the poor person may not know is that the likelihood of you living to 7 or 12 years, not super high. But if you did manage to survive at the end of it, not only were you free, but sometimes they gave you a plot of land, which in European culture, land ownership is the key to upward mobility. No land, no movement, no wealth. You also, when we talk about representative governments, have to own property. Okay, so slavery is going to become a major player. So eventually, even more labor is going to be needed to keep up with the demand. Because here's the thing, and you're going to talk about economics next year, but supply and demand is huge. The more demand that you have, the more you need to produce. And there's kind of a sweet spot. You don't want to flood the market, but you need to be able to produce for how many people are smoking. And the more people you get smoking and addicted to it, the more tobacco you need to provide. So the first Africans are going to be brought to Jamestown in 1619. You will see this, especially looking at anything having to do with more recent, like social justice, racism type things. A lot of them are going to bring up this year that that's really the beginning from their perspective of the American story. A lot of things happen at the same time, but that is a really important point that it takes almost, well, let me do math. It takes a little over 100 years for slavery to enter the Americas, but as soon as it does, it defines it. All right, so I apologize for that kind of cut there. One of my dogs came in and was barking super loud, so I apologize for that. One of the things that we need to talk about is the West Indies. And so this didn't happen before our experience in 1619. It is going to be claimed in 1612, but this is where England is going to really get into the sugarcane business. And they are, for the first time, going to be producing sugarcane. They realize that it's really labor intensive, and kind of on that same economic strain, if you're not thinking about the morality of it, the best way to make a profit is to get your labor costs down. And so if you can get into the slavery business, then you can keep your costs down and be competitive in the market. And so one of the things that the British are going to realize from their experience in Barbados is that one particular group is going to have the most immunity to the malarial issues that we're having. Africans from all over the continent were brought in for slavery purposes, but specifically people with sickle cell anemia, which was very, very common in West Africa, even though it's a terrible disease, made them immune to malaria. And so West Africans in particular became very attractive to slave traders. And so West Africa in particular, if you look at like the heritage of a lot of African Americans in particular, West Africa is going to be a very strong part of their line. And that's because essentially they were sought out specifically because of their ability to withstand malaria. So if you think about things, kind of those long-term ramifications for the African American community, Sickle cell anemia is a very common illness. And slavery wasn't necessarily like, things were not defined by race up to this point. Race was a construct that happened during this colonial period. You saw kind of that caste system from the Spanish, and that's going to be adopted in the Americas as well. But we're also going to have this absolute separation by race because it's very easy to define. There's a clip that I'll show you guys at another time, but essentially, the part of the reason why Africans were chosen was because it was very easy to identify them. It wasn't even that they were seen as necessarily lesser, though that construct does develop as an excuse for perpetuating slavery. Okay, so you have the development of slave codes. So these are laws specifically made to take away the humanity of people who were put into bondage. Okay, so the Barbados Slave Codes, this was written in 1661. This is, again, in Barbados. It's not in what will be the United States. It's not in the colonies. But again, it's tied to England. So this is a very consistent kind of feeling throughout the American colonies. So the Barbados Slave Code says, it declares that if any Negro or slave whatsoever shall offer any violence to any Christian by striking or the like, such Negro or slave shall be, for his first offense, be severely whipped by the constable. So a constable is an elected official who has no, it's not the person who should be punishing anyone, first of all. For his second offense of that nature, he shall be severely whipped, and his nose be slit, and be burned in some part of his face with a hot iron. And being brutish slaves, they deserve not, for the baseness of their condition, to be tried by the legal trial of 12 men of their peers, as subjects of the English they are, and is further enacted and ordained that if any Negro or other slave under punishment by his master unfortunately shall suffer in life or in member, so they die, or they lose an arm, which seldom happens, no person whatsoever shall be liable to any fine therefor. So essentially what they're saying is, if you misbehave, slave, there are no legal ramifications for you. They are well within their rights to kill you or maim you if you step out of line. This particular picture is from much closer to the Civil War period, but when you talk about slavery, pretty much every time this image is going to pop up because you have that heavy scarring from the whip, how many whips it had to have taken. I mean, you think about not comparing these at all, but how painful it is to be whipped by something. So kids like to snap each other with towels. That seems silly, but it really does hurt. So imagine being intentionally whipped by something that is intentionally painful, sometimes having barbs or sticks or metal pieces or glass pieces on the end of it to inflict the most pain possible. But also on the flip side, and this is one of those things in the American story that it makes us uncomfortable because we want to be excited, but we have these horrible things happening at the same time. You have your first official established representative government. You do have representatives in Virginia, but 1619, the same year that slaves enter the country, is going to be the same year that we have our first real representative government where colonists could make their own laws. Again, this is an elitist system. This does not include everyone. You have to own land to be able to vote or have a stake in society, but it's a step in the right direction. It is a big step compared to where they are. Okay, so women are going to arrive in Jamestown in 1620, so there's lots and lots and lots and lots of changes. So women start to arrive in 1620, 90 women arrive from England. So the arrival of women is really the marker of families are going to start. We're going to start establishing ourselves here because women, unless they're coming as an indentured servant, which is possible, when you have an all-male population, that is probably the inevitable result, is eventually most of those women will marry. This allows settlers to establish families and make Jamestown more of a permanent colony. And that's going to be the big difference with the English and the Spanish and the French, is that The English are going to establish long-term colonies where people actually live in these places for long periods of time. Okay, so this would be a picture of Jamestown in 1620. So, I mean, it's not a big place, but it's a major point in American history. A couple things that I just kind of need to mention as we go into our next few days of lecture is that early colonization is going to be impacted heavily by religion, particularly in the North. So the middle colonies and the New England colonies. And we're going to talk more about specifics of that here in a few days. But the Protestant Reformation, you're going to be very familiar with Martin Luther if you took European history. And his 95 Theses and trying to push back against corruption in the church. But we don't talk as much about John Calvin. John Calvin is going to be a really important figure because one of the more popular branch offs of the church in England is going to be Calvinism. And there's this idea of predestination. And predestination is this idea that you should be a good person, but not everybody gets into heaven. You should do the right thing and hope God has mercy on you and worship him, but only a few of us are going to heaven. It's this elite group. All the seats are taken. I'm going to heaven. I'm sorry you're not, but like you should keep going to church to be a good person. There's kind of this idea that we are part of the elite, this American exceptionalism. And we're going to look at a document that talks about, with John Winthrop, the city on the hill, that America is the city on the hill, a beacon of godliness and truth and justice. And all of that is going to be rooted in this particular branch. So predestination and being the best country ever, those things tie together when we talk about history. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So that's where we're going to leave off for today. So that's the notes that you need to complete. So have this ready by the time that you come to class next time.